400 pounds of unwashed raw sheep's fleece and 3 full cords of firewood left Abigail Preston's grandfather's rotting off-grid cabin smelling foul and feeling like a claustrophobic wooden tomb. To the locals of Darby, Montana, this was just the erratic hoarding of a paranoid city girl having a breakdown. Instead of using standard fiberglass insulation, she had sacrificed nearly all her living space to her bizarre preparations. Yet, when the catastrophic deep freeze of 2015 swallowed the valley with 70-mile-per-hour winds and 40 below zero temperatures, that very hoarding became her salvation. Without it, she would have frozen to death in her sleep. The wind sweeping down from the Bitterroot Mountains carried a razor-sharp chill, even though it was only the second week of September. Abigail Preston stood on the sagging front porch of the cabin, her breath pluming in the crisp autumn air. She had driven 3 days straight from Chicago, leaving behind a collapsed marriage and a suffocating corporate job, seeking refuge in the only property she owned, a dilapidated single-room timber cabin left to her by her late grandfather, Adrian. Adrian Preston had been a hardened, reclusive man. He lived off the grid for 4 decades, surviving solely on what he hunted, grew, and preserved. When the local sheriff found him passed away peacefully in his armchair a year ago, the town assumed the cabin would be sold for the land value. Nobody expected his 32-year-old granddaughter to show up in a rusted Subaru hauling a trailer full of canned goods, intent on surviving the Montana winter alone. "You're making a mistake, Abby," Tom Gallagher had told her just hours earlier. Tom owned the feed and seed in Darby and had known her grandfather well. He leaned over the counter, his weathered face pinched with genuine concern. Adrian was tough as boot leather, and even he struggled when the January snows hit. That cabin's foundation is shifting. The chinking between the logs is crumbling to dust. The first big blow comes down the canyon. It's going to cut right through those walls. "You need to hire a contractor, or better yet, rent a place in town." Abigail had stubbornly shaken her head. "I can fix the chinking, Tom. I've watched the tutorials. I have grandfather's tools." Tom had just sighed, handing her the receipt for 2 boxes of heavy-duty nails. "Tutorials don't keep your blood flowing when it's 30 below, girl. Just remember that." But it wasn't pride that kept Abigail at the cabin. It was an inexplicable gnawing instinct. That night, as she sorted through Adrian's dusty belongings by the light of a kerosene lamp, she found his old leather-bound journals. Most of the entries were mundane records of rainfall, deer sightings, and crop yields. But the final journal, written in the chaotic handwriting of a man whose mind was beginning to slip, contained frantic, repetitive warnings. The White Death of 78-1 entry read the ink pressed so hard it tore the paper. It took the Johnsons. It took the Miller boy. The cold doesn't just bite, it searches. It looks for the cracks. You can't just block it. You have to smother it. Wood on the inside, sheep in the walls. The lanolin stops the breath of the ice. Keep the wood inside. If it's outside, the ice locks it away. The ice locks everything away. Abigail stared at the words, a shiver tracing its way down her spine. The rational part of her brain, the part that analyzed risk management for a logistics firm, told her these were the ramblings of a senile old man suffering from isolation. But the cabin was utterly silent, save for the wind whistling faintly through a crack near the window frame. She held her hand to the timber wall. It was freezing to the touch. The next morning, Abigail drove into town, but not to the hardware store. She drove to a foreclosed sheep farm 20 miles south, owned by a man named John Cleary, who was desperately liquidating his assets before the bank seized them. "I want the fleeces," Abigail told him, standing in a barn that smelled violently of manure and wet animal. "All of the unsellable raw wool, the stuff you haven't scoured or carded." John, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, looked at her in bewilderment. "Lady, that wool is full of burrs dirt and raw lanolin. It smells like a wet dog rolled in grease. Nobody buys that unless they have a processing mill. I have about 400 pounds of it sitting in burlap sacks in the back. I was going to burn it. I'll give you $500 for all of it." Abigail said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded. She didn't know exactly why she was doing it, only that Adrian's words were echoing in her skull like a heavy bell. Sheep in the walls. By noon, she had strapped 6 massive bulging burlap sacks of raw, greasy wool to her trailer. But she wasn't done. Instead of returning to the cabin, she stopped at the local lumberyard and ordered 3 full cords of split hardwood tamarack fir and dense oak. "Wow, where do you want it dropped?" the delivery driver asked, chewing on a toothpick. "Beside the porch, I can tarp it for you for an extra 20. "No," Abigail said, looking him dead in the eye. "I want it dropped right at my front door, because I'm carrying every single piece of it inside the cabin." The driver paused, the toothpick dropping to his bottom lip. "Inside, ma'am, 3 cords of wood is a mountain. You'll have nowhere to sleep. The bugs, the moisture, it'll ruin your floors. It's a fire hazard." "Drop it at the door," Abigail repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. The compulsion had taken complete control. She felt like a soldier preparing for a siege, driven by a phantom commander she couldn't ignore. By late October, the whispering in Darby had turned to outright mockery. Whenever Abigail came into town for canned goods or batteries, conversations would suddenly halt. She had become the local eccentric, the crazy Preston girl. And her cabin certainly looked the part of a mad woman's lair. Inside the single 400-square-foot room, the transformation was jarring. The walls of the cabin were entirely lined with floor-to-ceiling stacks of firewood. She had built a fortress of timber along the north and west-facing walls, the directions from which the canyon winds blew. The logs were stacked intricately interlocked like a massive heavy puzzle. They consumed 3 feet of living space on all sides, turning the cabin into a narrow, dimly lit corridor leading to her wood stove and a tiny cot. But it was the smell that was truly overwhelming. Instead of traditional chinking or modern spray foam, Abigail had spent 3 grueling weeks stuffing the raw, unwashed sheep's wool into every single crack, crevice, and gap in the cabin's logs. She packed it tightly under the floorboards, around the window frames, and between the roof trusses. The raw lanolin, the natural grease secreted by sheep to waterproof their coats, coated her hands, her clothes, and the cabin walls. It smelled heavy, earthy, and pungent. She had even taken the remaining fleeces and nailed them directly over the interior walls, creating a bizarre, woolly tapestry that made the cabin look like the inside of an animal's stomach. One afternoon, Tom Gallagher drove up the mountain in his truck, ostensibly to deliver a package that had been misrouted to his store. When Abigail opened the heavy wooden door, the thick smell of lanolin and damp bark rolled out, hitting Tom so hard he physically took a step back. He peered past her shoulder, his eyes widening in horror at the walls of stacked firewood and the raw fleeces hanging from the ceiling. "Dear God, Abby," Tom muttered, wiping his brow despite the chill. "What have you done to this place? It's a tinderbox, and the smell. Honey, you can't live like this. You've lost your mind. Adrian was eccentric, but this is sickness. It's insulation, Tom," Abigail said defensively, crossing her arms. Her hands were blistered and stained yellow from the lanolin. She looked exhausted. She had lost weight, her eyes sunken with dark circles from the sheer physical labor of hauling 3 cords of wood indoors by herself. The wood creates a secondary thermal mass. It blocks the wind. The wool is naturally water-resistant and traps dead air. "It traps vermin is what it does," Tom snapped, his patience fraying. "The Weather Service is predicting a rough November, standard Montana winter. You're going to be trapped in this tiny, stinking box for months. Let me help you clear this out. We can stack the wood on the porch." "No." Abigail barked, surprising even herself with the ferocity in her voice. She stepped into the doorway, blocking his view. "Adrian said the ice locks it away. If it's outside, I won't be able to reach it. I'm staying right here." Tom shook his head, throwing his hands up in defeat. "Fine. But when you realize you're sleeping in a damp, bug-infested woodpile, don't expect me to dig you out." He threw the package onto the porch and marched back to his truck tires, spinning aggressively in the gravel as he drove away. Abigail stood alone on the porch, watching him leave. A heavy knot of doubt twisted in her stomach. Had she actually lost her mind? Had the trauma of her divorce and the stress of moving broken something in her brain? She looked at her raw, calloused hands. She was exhausted. The cabin was cramped dark and reeked of sheep. For a fleeting second she considered dragging the logs back outside, but then she noticed the silence. It was mid-November, usually a time when the forest was alive with the frantic scurry of squirrels hoarding nuts, the calls of jays, and the rustle of deer in the brush. Today, there was absolutely nothing. The woods were dead silent. Not a single bird chirped. The air felt incredibly heavy, pressing down on her eardrums like she was underwater. She looked up at the sky. Above the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots, the clouds weren't the usual soft gray of a snowstorm. They were a bruised, sickly purple, churning with an unnatural, violent energy. Abigail went inside and locked the heavy deadbolt. She walked over to her battery-operated emergency radio and switched it on. The station crackled with intense static before the automated robotic voice of the emergency alert system broke through, repeating on a loop. The National Weather Service has issued a catastrophic winter weather emergency for Ravalli County. This is not a standard winter storm. A rare polar vortex collapse is merging with a Pacific moisture plume. Expect rapid temperature drops of 50 degrees within 1 hour, freezing rain followed by hurricane-force wind, gusts up to 80 miles per hour. Complete grid failure is guaranteed. Do not attempt to travel. Exposure outside will result in death within minutes. May God be with you. Abigail's heart slammed against her ribs. The broadcast didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like an obituary. She rushed to the window and looked out. The temperature on the mercury thermometer nailed to the porch post was plummeting so fast she could actually see the red line sinking. It went from 35 degrees to 20 to 10 in the span of 20 minutes. Then the first drop of freezing rain hit the glass. It didn't splash. It hit with a sharp crack, freezing instantly to the pane. The white death of 78. She thought her breath catching in her throat. Adrian had been right. It didn't begin as a blizzard. It began as an aerial assault of sheer solid ice. At 4 p.m., the sky turned pitch black, as if someone had thrown a heavy blanket over the sun. The freezing rain intensified into a torrential downpour of supercooled water that froze the microsecond it touched a surface. Within an hour, Abigail's Subaru was encased in 3 inches of solid opaque ice. The trees outside began to groan under the unimaginable weight, their branches bending like bows drawn to their breaking points. Inside the cabin, Abigail scrambled to prepare. She lit the cast-iron wood stove, throwing in 3 logs of dense oak. The fire roared to life, casting dancing orange shadows against the claustrophobic walls of firewood that surrounded her. At 5:30 p.m., the power in the valley died. Looking out her window toward Darby, Abigail saw the distant faint lights of the town extinguish simultaneously, plunging the world into a terrifying primordial darkness. She was entirely cut off. No roads, no power, no help. Then the wind arrived. It hit the cabin with the concussive force of a runaway freight train. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched shrieking roar that vibrated through Abigail's teeth. The entire structure shuddered violently. Crack. Outside, a massive ponderosa pine snapped under the weight of the ice and the fury of the wind sounding like a cannon firing. The ground trembled as the 50-foot tree slammed into the earth just yards from the cabin. Abigail huddled on her cot, wrapping herself in a heavy sleeping bag, her eyes darting around the room. The wind was hitting the north wall with sustained gusts of 80 miles per hour. The old fragile timbers of Adrian's cabin began to scream, bowing slightly inward under the immense atmospheric pressure. Suddenly she realized the genius of her crazy preparations. Had the cabin been empty, the sheer kinetic force of the wind pushing against the weakened logs would have buckled the walls, collapsing the roof down on top of her. But the north wall didn't buckle. It held firm. The 3 cords of heavy solid firewood she had stacked floor to ceiling on the inside acted as an impenetrable reinforced retaining wall. The logs absorbed the shock waves of the wind, bracing the fragile timber from the inside out. But the wind wasn't the only enemy. It was the cold. Outside, the temperature had bottomed out at 45 degrees below zero, not factoring in the wind chill. At those temperatures, even microscopic gaps in a cabin's chinking would allow drafts so violently cold they could extinguish a fire and drop the interior temperature below freezing in minutes. Abigail placed her hand against the raw, dirty wool she had shoved into the cracks. It was a miracle of nature. The dense, curly fibers trapped millions of tiny pockets of air, while the heavy, greasy lanolin acted as an absolute vapor and wind barrier. While the exterior of the cabin was being blasted by sub-zero death, not a single draft penetrated the wool. The grease literally froze into a solid, impermeable seal, cementing the logs together. The heat from the wood stove was trapped perfectly within the small, insulated space. The interior walls of stacked firewood absorbed the radiant heat from the stove, acting as a massive thermal battery radiating warmth back into the tiny living area. It was 90 degrees inside the cabin. Abigail was actually sweating. She let out a shaky laugh, wiping tears of sheer relief from her eyes. "You are a genius, Grandpa," she whispered to the empty room. "You are an absolute genius." She felt a momentary surge of triumph. She had beaten the storm. She was safe, but nature, it seemed, despised arrogance. At exactly 2 a.m., the wind direction shifted, violently swirling into a blinding vortex that funneled down the canyon. It caught the heavy metal chimney pipe protruding from the cabin's roof. With a horrific shriek of tearing metal, a 90-mile-per-hour gust ripped the rain cap in the top section of the chimney pipe entirely off the roof. Instantly, the vacuum created by the storm outside violently sucked the smoke and flames backward down the chimney. The heavy iron door of the wood stove blew open with a deafening bang. A cloud of blinding, choking black smoke and red-hot embers erupted into the tiny cabin. Abigail screamed, throwing her arms up as a shower of sparks rained down on her sleeping bag. She rolled off the cot, hitting the floor just as the cabin began to fill rapidly with toxic carbon monoxide. The fire, her only source of life, was now actively trying to kill her, and with the chimney compromised, the exhaust had nowhere to go but inside. She crawled on her hands and knees beneath the thick layer of black smoke, coughing violently, her eyes burning and streaming with tears. She had to put the fire out immediately or she would suffocate. But if she put the fire out, the cabin would lose its heat source in the middle of a minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit blizzard. Gasping for air, she reached the stove and grabbed the metal ash bucket, throwing a scoop of cold ash over the blazing logs. The fire hissed and choked, plunging the room into darkness. Silence returned to the interior save for the howling wind outside. The smoke slowly began to settle. But as Abigail knelt on the floor, shivering in the sudden dark, a new terrifying reality set in. The heat was gone. The thermal mass of the firewood would only keep the cabin warm for a few hours. Without a working chimney, she couldn't light another fire. And the storm outside was just getting started. The darkness inside the cabin was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. After the hiss of the cold ash hitting the embers faded, the only sound was the monstrous, unrelenting roar of the blizzard tearing at the timber walls. Abigail knelt on the floorboards, her lungs burning, coughing up the acrid taste of soot and carbon monoxide. Her eyes watered profusely, stinging from the dense smoke that still hung in the air. She fumbled in the pitch black, her hands blindly scraping across the rough bark of the firewood stacked against the wall until she found the heavy plastic cylinder of her emergency flashlight. She clicked it on. The beam sliced through a thick swirling haze of gray. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze her. The wood stove, the literal beating heart of her survival, was dead. Abigail checked the ambient thermometer mounted near the cot. It read 72 degrees. The massive walls of firewood she had hauled inside were doing exactly what she had hoped. They were radiating the heat they had absorbed over the past 6 hours. The air was still warm, but the clock was now ticking. With an outside temperature of minus 45 and hurricane-force winds actively stripping heat from the exterior logs, the thermal mass would only keep the cabin above freezing for another 3, maybe 4 hours. After that, the cold would sink its teeth into the room and the temperature would plummet to lethal levels. She could not just wait for the wind to die down. The radio had said this storm would last for days. She had to fix the chimney draft. Shining the light on the cast iron stove, she analyzed the problem. The chimney pipe went straight up through the roof. With the directional rain cap blown off, the high-velocity wind sweeping over the roof was creating a high-pressure zone, forcing air violently down the pipe. If she lit a match right now, the smoke would instantly blow back into her face. She needed to cap the pipe, but not seal it completely. She needed a directional vent, something that would block the wind from the north but allow the exhaust to escape to the south. She crawled over to her grandfather's rusted metal workbench in the corner. Her beam scanned the chaotic shelves until it landed on a massive gallon-sized tin can of bulk coffee. Dumping the brown grounds onto the floor, she grabbed a pair of heavy-duty aviation snips and a pair of leather work gloves. Her hands were shaking, trembling from adrenaline and the lingering effects of the smoke inhalation. She forced herself to breathe slowly, focusing entirely on the metal in her hands. She cut away half of the cylinder side, leaving the top intact, creating a makeshift hood. She checked the thermometer again. It had been 20 minutes. The temperature had dropped to 64 degrees. The heat was bleeding out faster than she calculated. She found a spool of thick braided steel wire and her grandfather's heavy leather tool belt. She strapped it on, dropping the modified coffee can, a pair of pliers, and an ice pick into the pouches. Abigail looked toward the heavy oak door. The very idea of stepping out into that apocalyptic maelstrom made her stomach twist into a hard knot. Adrian's journal entry echoed in her mind. Exposure outside will result in death within minutes. Not today, she whispered to the empty room. She began to layer her clothing methodically. Merino wool base layer, heavy flannel, a thick fleece pullover, and finally Adrian's stiff wax-coated canvas ranch coat. She pulled on 2 pairs of wool socks, stepping into her heavy insulated pass boots. She wrapped a thick wool scarf around her lower face and pulled down a heavy knit beanie, leaving only a narrow slit for her eyes. Finally, she grabbed a heavy 50-foot coil of nylon climbing rope. She tied a secure bowline knot around her waist, anchoring the other end to the iron leg of the wood stove. If the wind blew her off the roof, she would at least remain tethered to the cabin, rather than being swept away into the black timber where she would never be found. She stepped to the door, grabbed the iron handle, and pushed. It didn't budge. The supercooled freezing rain from earlier in the evening had seeped into the frame, and the sheer drop in temperature had welded the door shut with an inch-thick layer of solid ice. She slammed her shoulder against the wood. Nothing. It felt like pushing against a concrete wall. Desperation flared. She was trapped. She grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from the woodpile, wedged the flat edge into the door jamb, and threw her entire body weight backward. The wood groaned, the ice cracked with a sound like a rifle shot, and the heavy door burst outward. Nothing could have prepared her for the violence of the world outside. The instant the door opened, the storm attacked her. It wasn't just wind. It was a physical, solid force. A gust hit her square in the chest, violently throwing her backward into the cabin. She hit the floor hard, the wind howling through the open doorway, instantly sucking the remaining warmth from the room and replacing it with a biting, agonizing cold that felt like liquid nitrogen. Gasping, Abigail scrambled to her feet, leaning forward at a 45-degree angle just to step out onto the porch. She forced the door shut behind her, plunging herself into the shrieking darkness. The noise was deafening. It was a mechanical, roaring scream, the sound of millions of trees being tortured by the wind branches snapping and shattering like glass. The snow wasn't falling. It was moving perfectly horizontally, driving ice crystals into her exposed skin like birdshot. Her flashlight beam barely penetrated 5 feet into the whiteout. She found the heavy wooden ladder leaning against the side of the porch. It was encased in ice. She kicked the base violently with her heavy boots, shattering the frozen crust, and dragged it to the front of the cabin beneath the edge of the roof. The wind was pulling at her clothes, trying to find a way in. Despite the heavy layers, the cold was already seeping into her bones. Her fingers, even inside the heavy leather gloves, were beginning to ache with a deep throbbing pain. She knew she had less than 10 minutes before frostbite began to permanently destroy the tissue in her extremities. She mounted the ladder. The rungs were impossibly slick. Every step was a calculated risk. As she cleared the edge of the roofline, the full unshielded brunt of the 70-mile-per-hour wind hit her. It literally lifted her left foot off the rung. Abigail screamed a sound, entirely lost to the storm, and threw her arms over the icy shingles, hugging the edge of the roof. She pressed her face against the frozen wood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Move! You have to move! Using the sharp tip of the ice pick, she drove a small hole into the ice-covered shingles, giving her gloved hand something to grip. She pulled herself up onto the slanted surface. The roof was a sheet of black ice. She belly-crawled inch by agonizing inch toward the peak, dragging the tethered rope behind her. Halfway up, a terrifying realization washed over her. The cabin was shaking, not just vibrating, but swaying. The sheer force of the wind pushing against the structure was testing the limits of the old timber. But then she felt a deep, resonant solidity beneath her. The 3 cords of firewood stacked inside. She was lying right above the reinforced north wall. The wood was holding the cabin together. Her crazy hoarding was the only thing keeping the roof from collapsing beneath her. She reached the peak and straddled it, shining her light on the broken chimney pipe. The metal was jagged and torn where the cap had been ripped away. The wind was howling down into the 6-inch opening like a jet engine. Her hands were going numb. The throbbing pain had been replaced by a terrifying, sluggish deadness. She pulled the modified coffee can from her pouch. Her fingers were so clumsy she dropped the pliers. They clattered down the icy roof and vanished into the void below. "No, no, no!" She cursed, her voice muffled by the scarf. She didn't need the pliers. She had the steel wire. She jammed the open half of the coffee can over the pipe, rotating it so the solid metal faced directly into the screaming north wind, and the open cutout faced the sheltered south. Working blindly, relying purely on muscle memory and sheer panic, she wrapped the thick steel wire around the can and the pipe, binding them together. She twisted the wire tight with her thumbs, tearing the leather of her gloves, ignoring the stinging pain as a sharp end sliced through to her skin. She wrapped it 5 times, securing it as tightly as she could manage with failing hands. It wasn't pretty, and it wouldn't last forever, but the heavy tin held firm against the wind. She didn't linger. The cold was making her vision blur, the edges of her sight going dark. She scrambled backward, sliding down the icy slope of the roof, her feet finding the top rung of the ladder by pure luck. She descended rapidly, practically falling the last 3 feet into the snow. She grabbed the door handle, her frozen fingers barely able to grip the iron. She threw her weight backward, tearing the door open, and collapsed onto the floor of the cabin, kicking the door shut behind her with a heavy slam. She lay on the floorboards in the pitch black, violently shivering her teeth, chattering so hard she thought they might crack. The ambient temperature in the cabin had dropped to 38 degrees. She could see her breath, but she was alive. It took her 5 agonizing minutes to force her stiff, frozen fingers to strike a match. She opened the stove door, arranged a pile of dry kindling, and touched the flame to the wood. The fire flared. Abigail held her breath, waiting for the smoke to blow back in her face. It didn't. The flames curled upward, licking the heavier logs, and with a soft whoosh, the smoke drafted perfectly up the pipe and out the makeshift vent. The heat bloomed outward. Abigail collapsed against the side of the wood pile, weeping silently into her hands as the life-saving warmth washed over her face. By 6 a.m., the interior of the cabin was a sweltering 95 degrees again. The massive thermal battery of the stacked firewood had absorbed the heat from the roaring stove, radiating it back into the small space. The raw wool, stuffed into the cracks, held the heat with aggressive efficiency, creating an impenetrable, suffocating cocoon of safety against the ongoing apocalypse outside. Abigail sat in an old rocking chair, draped in a dry blanket, staring blankly at the dancing orange light spilling from the stove's glass door. The physical toll of the night had left her hollowed out, her muscles aching, and her hands bandaged where the steel wire had cut her. The wind outside had not diminished. It still shrieked with the same terrifying intensity, a constant abrasive assault on the senses. She was just pouring a cup of melted snow water from a kettle when she heard it. Thump. It was faint, barely distinguishable from the cacophony of the storm. Abigail froze the kettle, hovering over her mug. Thump. Thump. It was low, rhythmic, and heavy. It wasn't a tree branch hitting the roof. It was coming from the heavy oak front door. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather spiked down her spine. No one was out there. No one could be out there. The road was buried under 3 feet of solid ice and drifting snow. The temperature was still -40. Stepping outside meant death. Thump. She set the kettle down quietly. She reached over to the workbench and picked up the heavy steel crowbar. Holding it tightly, she crept toward the door. "Who is it?" she yelled, her voice sounding raspy and weak against the howling wind. There was no answer, just another slow, deliberate scrape against the wood. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open an inch. A massive weight immediately collapsed against the wood, forcing the door open wider. Abigail jumped back, raising the crowbar, as a shape spilled onto the floor of the cabin, bringing a cloud of swirling, freezing snow with it. It was a man. He was completely covered in a thick shell of white rime ice, his clothes frozen stiff. He wasn't wearing a winter coat. He was wearing a standard-issue tan uniform shirt, the sleeves rolled up, and a Kevlar vest. Abigail dropped the crowbar. It was Deputy Harrison from the county sheriff's department. "Oh my God," she gasped, rushing forward. She grabbed the collar of his vest and hauled him fully into the cabin, slamming the door shut against the storm. The deputy was in a state of catastrophic medical failure. His skin was a ghastly, waxy gray tinged with dark blue around his lips and nose. His eyes were open, but rolled back in his head. He wasn't shivering. That was the most terrifying sign. When a victim of extreme hypothermia stops shivering, their core temperature has dropped below 90 degrees. The body gives up trying to generate heat and prepares to die. Worse, he had experienced paradoxical undressing. In the final hallucinatory stages of freezing to death, the brain misinterprets the complete failure of the nervous system as intense burning heat, causing victims to tear off their clothes in a blizzard. Harrison had likely shed his heavy parka miles down the road. "Harrison! Hey, look at me!" Abigail shouted, slapping his frozen cheek. It felt like hitting a slab of marble. There was no response. She had to act instantly, but her corporate logistics background reminded her of the brutal reality of severe hypothermia. If she warmed his extremities too quickly, the cold, stagnant blood in his arms and legs would rush back to his heart, causing a fatal cardiac arrhythmia known as afterdrop. She couldn't put him directly next to the stove. She had to warm his core slowly from the inside out. She dragged him away from the intense, radiant heat of the wood stove, moving him into the narrow, dimly lit corridor created by her massive stacks of indoor firewood. The ambient temperature here was a steady, humid 85 degrees, insulated perfectly by the raw wool in the walls. She frantically stripped off his frozen, rigid uniform shirt and vest. His chest was ice cold. She pulled 3 heavy raw sheep fleeces down from where she had nailed them to the wall. The greasy, lanolin-soaked wool was dense, heavy, and held an incredible amount of ambient heat. She rolled Harrison onto his side, slipping one fleece beneath him to insulate him from the floorboards, and piled the other 2 directly over his bare chest and groin, wrapping him like a mummy. The raw wool immediately began to trap the microcurrents of heat his body was still faintly producing, creating a highly effective microclimate. Next, she needed internal heat. She grabbed the kettle from the stove. The water wasn't boiling, but it was hot. She poured it into 2 plastic Nalgene bottles, wrapping them in thick wool socks to prevent burns, and shoved them under the fleeces, placing one directly in his armpit and the other near his groin, where the major arteries lay close to the surface. "Come on!" she whispered, her hands covered in the greasy lanolin pressing against his chest. His breathing was incredibly shallow, a ragged gasp every 10 seconds. For an hour, she sat in the sweltering, sheep-scented darkness of her firewood corridor, monitoring his pulse. The wind screamed outside, battering the cabin, but inside the silence was heavy with anticipation. Slowly, agonizingly, the color began to change. The waxy gray of his skin shifted to a pale, mottled red. Suddenly, Harrison drew in a massive, ragged breath and coughed violently. His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. He began to thrash his muscles, seizing as violent, uncontrollable shivering finally racked his body. It was a beautiful sight. The shivering meant his central nervous system was coming back online. "Hold still! Hold still!" Abigail ordered, pressing her hands firmly against his shoulders to keep him from throwing off the heavy fleeces. "You're safe. You're inside. Don't move." Harrison's teeth chattered so violently he could barely form words. He stared up at the ceiling at the bizarre tapestry of hanging raw wool, and then at the massive claustrophobic walls of firewood looming over him. "Where?" He gasped, his eyes darting in panic. "Where am I?" "You're at the Preston cabin," Abigail said, wiping the sweat from her own forehead. "You crashed your truck." Harrison nodded weakly, groaning in pain as the blood began to painfully circulate back into his frozen fingers. Black ice slid off the logging road into the ravine. Radio was dead. I had to walk. God, it burned. It burned so hot. "I know," Abigail said softly, "but you're okay now." Harrison looked around again, his mind slowly clearing enough to register his surroundings. The heavy smell of sheep, the oppressive heat, the fortress of timber inside the tiny room. The very things the town had mocked her for. "They said," Harrison forced out between violently chattering teeth, staring at the thick wall of oak logs next to his head. "They said you were crazy." Abigail looked at her raw lanolin-stained hands, then up at the sturdy logs that were silently holding the roof against the fury of the 70-mile-per-hour winds. She smiled, a weary, hard-won expression. "Yeah," she replied, "crazy like a fox." For 72 hours, the sun ceased to exist. There was no dawn, no dusk, only a monochromatic existence defined by the unrelenting, shrieking darkness of the blizzard. Inside the cabin, time had lost its linear flow, measured now by the rhythmic, desperate chores of survival, boiling melted snow for hydration, feeding the insatiable iron heart of the wood stove, and monitoring the terrifying transformation of Deputy Harrison's frostbitten hands. The adrenaline that had fueled Abigail's initial rescue had burned off, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Every movement felt like wading through molasses. Harrison's recovery was brutally slow. By the second day, the waxy, death-like pallor of his hypothermia had been replaced by the excruciating reality of deep tissue damage. Massive fluid-filled blisters had erupted across his fingers and toes, the skin beneath a bruised, angry shade of purple. "Don't pop them," Abigail warned, her voice raspy from the dry wood smoke-tinged air. She sat on the floorboards, applying a thick layer of raw lanolin she had scraped from the spare fleeces. "If those blisters tear, infection will kill you before the cold ever gets a chance. The lanolin is a natural barrier. Grandpa Adrian swore by it." Harrison offered a weak, trembling nod. He was propped up against a stack of oak logs wrapped tightly in the heavy wool fleeces like a mummy. "You saved me, Abigail. I was dead out there. I didn't even know which way was town anymore." "Save your breath," she replied, gently wrapping a clean strip of an old bedsheet over his hands. "We aren't through this yet." She was intimately aware of a terrifying, creeping threat that Harrison in his delirium hadn't yet noticed. Her fortress was disappearing. The 3 cords of wood she had stacked floor to ceiling around the interior of the cabin were doing their job, but at a staggering cost. The logs acted as a massive thermal battery, trapping the stove's heat while physically bracing the weakened exterior walls against the 70-mile-per-hour gusts. But to maintain the 90-degree heat necessary to counteract the -40-degree drafts and keep a critically injured man alive, the cast-iron stove required constant feeding. Every few hours, Abigail had to pull 4 massive logs from her interior walls. By the end of the 3rd day, the eastern wall was completely gone. The northern wall, the critical barrier absorbing the brunt of the canyon winds, was severely depleted, reduced to a single layer of timber only 3 feet high. The cabin, which had felt like a claustrophobic wooden tomb just days ago, was suddenly feeling terrifyingly spacious. As the wood vanished, the silent thief, the cold, began to reclaim the room. Without the massive wall of timber to radiate heat, the ambient temperature slowly began to drop. It went from 90 degrees down to 80, and by the morning of the 4th day, it was hovering at a precarious 65. The raw sheep's wool stuffed into the cracks was still holding the wind at bay, but the structural integrity of the cabin was reaching a breaking point. To make matters worse, Harrison's condition took a turn for the worse. The dead tissue in his hands had triggered a systemic response. A violent fever took hold. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his teeth chattered uncontrollably despite the heavy blankets. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering about his police radio and his abandoned truck in the ravine. Abigail crushed 2 ibuprofen, the last of her supplies, into a cup of hot water and forced him to drink. "Come on, Harrison. Stay with me. Drink." As she pulled the cup away, a sound echoed through the cabin that made her heart stop. It wasn't the wind. It was a deep structural groan followed by a sharp, deafening crack like a rifle shot coming from the timber itself. Abigail spun around her flashlight beam, cutting through the dim room toward the north wall. With the massive weight of the inner firewood removed, the old exterior logs were losing their brace. The sheer kinetic force of the blizzard, combined with the thousands of pounds of solid ice clinging to the outside of the cabin, was finally winning the war of attrition. The center horizontal beam of the north wall was visibly bowing inward. As she watched in horror, the log groaned again, bending another inch into the living space. A shower of dust and dried moss exploded from the ceiling joists. If that log snapped, the entire wall would instantly collapse, allowing the hurricane-force cold to blast directly into the cabin. At 40 below zero, they would both be dead within minutes. "Abigail." Harrison mumbled, his fever-bright eyes tracking her sudden movement. What was that sound? "The wall is failing," Abigail said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. The panic inside her was so overwhelming, it had looped back around into cold, calculating logic. She had seconds to act before the Bitterroot Mountains reclaimed the cabin and everything inside it. She lunged toward the remaining pile of firewood on the south wall, grabbing 2 heavy 5-foot lengths of uncut oak. They must have weighed 60 pounds each. She dragged them across the floorboards, her muscles screaming in protest. She wasn't just a homeowner anymore. She was a combat engineer in a war against the sky. She had to shore up the beam, or the sanctuary she had built would become their coffin. "I need to shore up the beam." Abigail's voice tore through the heavy air of the cabin, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the deafening mechanical roar of the 70-mile-per-hour wind outside. She wasn't speaking to Harrison. She was shouting to keep her own terror at bay. She dropped to her knees beside the heavy cast-iron wood stove, gripping the rough, abrasive bark of the first 60-pound oak log she had dragged across the room. Her muscles, already pushed to absolute failure over the last 4 days, screamed in agonizing protest. She wedged the flat, cleanly chopped base of the heavy log securely against the immovable iron foot of the stove. Panting heavily, a sheen of cold sweat breaking across her forehead, she angled the top of the heavy timber upward, aiming directly for the center of the bowing north wall. It wasn't enough. As she tried to push the heavy oak upward into a bracing position, the exterior wind howled with renewed fury. A sustained violent gust hit the side of the cabin with the concussive force of a runaway freight train. The entire structure visibly shuddered. Under the immense atmospheric pressure, the gap between the failing exterior logs widened. A thick patch of the raw, greasy sheep's wool insulation was forcefully squeezed out of the crack, popping into the room like a cork from a bottle. Instantly, a needle-thin, high-velocity spray of sub-zero ice crystals shot through the breach. The jet of -40-degree air sliced across the room, hitting Abigail's cheek like a swarm of angry hornets. The ambient thermometer mounted on the wall dropped a terrifying 5 degrees in a matter of seconds. A puddle of melted snow near her boots froze solid almost instantly. It's not holding!" Abigail screamed, her voice cracking with pure desperation. She desperately tried to jam the second massive oak log beside the first, hoping to create a reinforcing V-shape to distribute the kinetic load. But the angle was completely wrong, and the heavy log kept slipping on the damp, slick floorboards. She simply didn't have the leverage. She needed someone to hold the base steady, anchoring it to the floor while she wedged the top directly under the failing timber. She whipped her head around her flashlight beam, cutting through the dim, freezing air. Harrison was slumped against the remaining firewood pale, shaking violently with his fever, his hands wrapped in bloody lanolin-soaked rags. He looked like a corpse that hadn't quite realized it was dead yet. "Harrison, I need you now." The young deputy blinked his eyes, rolling lazily as he tried to focus through the thick, suffocating haze of his systemic infection. But when his gaze finally locked onto the bowing wall and he felt the biting sting of the ice crystals spraying into the room, something deep within his subconscious took over. The primal, desperate will to survive bypassed his failing body. With a ragged, agonizing groan, Harrison threw off the heavy sheep fleeces, revealing a sweat-soaked undershirt that was already freezing against his skin. He didn't try to stand; his legs wouldn't have supported him. Instead, he dragged himself across the rough floorboards, using only his elbows and knees, desperately keeping his severely frostbitten, blistered hands elevated to protect them from the impact. What do I do?" He gasped, his teeth chattering so violently he routinely bit his own lip, leaving a smear of red across his chin as he collapsed next to the iron stove. "Put your boots against the base of this log." Abigail ordered, her raw, blistered hands bleeding as she gripped the rough bark of the oak. "Do not let it slide backward. If it slips, the wall comes down and we die right here. Anchor it." Harrison gritted his teeth, a feral sound escaping his throat. He swung his legs around, sliding the heavy rubber soles of his Pax boots squarely against the bottom of the log, locking his knees straight. He braced his back against the floorboards. "Go!" he roared, veins standing out in sharp relief on his neck. Abigail threw her entire body weight upward. She drove her shoulder into the rough bark, pushing with every ounce of strength she had left in her battered frame. The top of the heavy oak log scraped violently against the ceiling joist, sliding perfectly into place directly beneath the bowing center beam. Crack! The wind hit the cabin again, a monstrous, sustained blow. The pressure transferred directly from the frozen exterior wall down through the makeshift oak brace and straight into Harrison's locked legs. The deputy screamed in absolute blinding agony as the sheer kinetic force compressed his joints, threatening to shatter his knees. But he didn't budge a single inch. "Push it!" he bellowed over the storm. Abigail snatched the heavy steel crowbar from the floor. She wedged the forged flat end under the base of the log right between Harrison's boots and hammered it violently against the floorboards. Clang, clang, clang! She forced the oak wedge a crucial permanent half-inch deeper, locking it rigidly into place. The violent bowing of the wall stopped abruptly. The heavy oak braces anchored by the floorboards and the massive iron stove absorbed the relentless pressure of the blizzard. The structure groaned like a dying animal, but it held firm. Abigail collapsed flat onto her back, gasping for air, her chest heaving as she stared up at the dark ceiling. The cabin was suddenly plunged back into relative silence, save for the muffled, impotent roar of the wind outside. She didn't stay down for long. Crawling on her hands and knees over to the breach where the insulation had blown out, she grabbed a massive handful of raw, greasy sheep's fleece. She shoved it forcefully into the open crack, packing it as tightly as she could. The thick, heavy lanolin instantly froze against the cold exterior air, expanding and creating a perfect, impenetrable cement seal. The deadly draft stopped completely. "We did it," Abigail whispered, her voice a hollow, exhausted rasp. She looked over at Harrison. The deputy had passed out from the sheer overwhelming pain, his head slumped awkwardly against the side of the wood stove. Thankfully, his chest was rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic cadence. Abigail slowly dragged him back to his makeshift bed in the corner, gently recovering him with the heavy, heat-trapping fleeces. She walked over to the wood stove and opened the heavy iron door. Inside, only a few red embers glowed in a bed of gray ash. She picked up the last 3 logs from the floor, the absolute last of the 3 cords she had hauled inside weeks ago. She fed them into the fire, fully aware that when they burned to ash, the heat would be gone forever. She slumped deeply into her grandfather's old rocking chair, pulling a thick blanket tightly around her shivering shoulders, and stared blankly at the dancing orange flames. She had done everything right. She had built her fortress, insulated the cracks, and held the line against the impossible. But the wood was finally gone. She closed her eyes, preparing for the creeping cold to finally claim them in their sleep. Abigail woke with a violent start. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She gripped the arms of the rocking chair, her eyes darting around the dim, freezing cabin. The fire in the stove had died completely, leaving only a bed of cold gray ash. The ambient temperature in the room had plummeted to 31 degrees. She could see her breath pluming in thick white clouds. But that wasn't what had woken her. It was the silence. The oppressive shrieking roar of the wind that had battered her eardrums for 5 continuous days was gone. The walls were completely still. The terrifying vibration of the timber had ceased entirely. She scrambled out of the chair, her joints stiff and aching from the cold. She rushed to the heavy oak door and threw the deadbolt. She grabbed the handle and pulled. It didn't open. The door was blocked by an immense solid wall of white. Panic flared, but she quickly realized it wasn't ice locking the frame. It was a massive snowdrift. The wind had buried the entire front porch beneath 10 feet of packed snow. She grabbed the heavy iron ash shovel from beside the stove and began to furiously hack at the white wall. Chunks of dense snow fell into the cabin as she dug a narrow tunnel upward, her breath tearing raggedly in her throat. After 10 minutes of frantic digging, the shovel broke through the crust. A blinding shaft of pure, brilliant sunlight pierced the gloom of the cabin. Abigail dropped the shovel, using her gloved hands to widen the hole until she could squeeze her upper body through. She pulled herself up onto the surface of the snowdrift, blinking rapidly against the blinding glare. The world had been entirely transformed. The valley of Darby was buried beneath an ocean of glittering, untouched white. The massive pine trees drooped under thousands of pounds of snow, looking like hunched white giants. The sky above was a painful crystalline blue, utterly devoid of clouds. The deep freeze had finally broken. Down in the valley, the faint mechanical hum of heavy machinery drifted up the canyon. The county plows were already at work. "Abigail," a weak voice called from down inside the dark cabin. She slid backward down the snow tunnel, dropping onto the floorboards. Harrison was awake, shivering violently in the cold, but his eyes were clear. The fever had broken. "It's over," Abigail said, a tear finally escaping her eye, freezing halfway down her dirt-streaked cheek. "The storm is over." It took the rescue crews another 12 hours to reach them. By late afternoon, the deep rattling roar of a massive diesel engine shook the ground outside. A bright yellow county front-end loader had cleared the logging road, followed closely by a sheriff's SUV and a familiar rusted pickup truck. Abigail, wrapped in Adrian's heavy canvas coat, stood in the tunnel doorway as the men waded through the waist-deep snow toward the porch. Tom Gallagher was leading the pack, carrying a heavy iron pry bar and a body bag. His face was grim-etched with the sorrow of a man expecting to recover a frozen corpse. When he looked up and saw Abigail standing in the doorway, very much alive, he dropped the pry bar into the snow. "Mother of God," Tom whispered, his jaw going slack. 2 paramedics pushed past him, rushing into the cabin with medical bags. When they saw Deputy Harrison lying on the floor, wrapped in bloody bandages and raw sheep fleeces, their shouts echoed out into the quiet air. "We need a backboard. We have a survivor. Pulse is thready, but he's alive." Tom Gallagher slowly waded up the snowbank, stopping right in front of Abigail. He looked past her shoulder into the cabin. The interior looked like a war zone. The floor was covered in sawdust and frozen puddles. The massive heavy oak logs were wedged violently against the north wall, physically holding the ceiling up. The walls were plastered in raw, foul-smelling sheep's wool. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a bunker that had barely survived a direct artillery strike. "You," Tom stammered, taking off his hat, his hands shaking. "The whole town thought you were dead, Abby. The wind chill hit -60. The power grid collapsed. We lost 3 roofs in town. How are you standing here?" Abigail looked at Tom, then turned to look at the empty corners where her massive walls of firewood had once stood. She thought of Adrian's frantic scrawled journals. Keep the wood inside. The lanolin stops the breath of the ice. She looked back at Tom, a small, exhausted smile touching the corners of her lips. I listened to the crazy people, Tom, she said quietly, and I brought the wood inside. As the paramedics carefully loaded Harrison onto a specialized sled to drag him down to the waiting ambulance, the deputy weakly reached out, grabbing the sleeve of Abigail's coat with his heavily bandaged hand. "You don't sell this place," Harrison rasped, coughing into the freezing air. "You hear me, you stay." Abigail looked at the battered, scarred logs of her grandfather's cabin. It was broken, freezing, and smelled violently of sheep, but it had held. "I'm not going anywhere," she replied. Abigail's story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the crazy methods passed down by our ancestors hold more scientific truth and survival value than modern convenience ever could. When the world freezes over, it's not the opinions of the crowd that will keep your blood pumping. It's the raw, unyielding preparation you've put in behind closed doors. Adrian Preston knew that the elements don't negotiate, and Abigail's willingness to look foolish in the eyes of her neighbors is the singular reason she and Deputy Harrison didn't become tragic footnotes in the local archives. If this deep dive into real-life survival and against-the-odds ingenuity kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to help the algorithm share Abigail's incredible story with others. Subscribe for more gripping, true-to-life survival dramas, and drop a comment below. Would you have dragged 3 cords of wood inside your house or trusted the fiberglass? Let me know.